It probably followed very naturally that when Splatoon 2 was released, that in addition to trying to improve upon the multiplayer experience, it would also attempt to build on the game's single player with its own hero mode. One that, like the story campaign of its predecessor, could serve as a tutorial for the newcomer. What made the situation very different though for Hero Mode 2, as I like to call it, is that unlike the first Hero Mode, it seems to have been developed side by side with the multiplayer from the very beginning of development, to the point where the team had considered even advertising how players' actions in Splatoon 1 could affect the actual story of the sequel. During the course of Nintendo's support for the first game, a series of online multiplayer events, known as Splatfest, were frequently hosted in-game. The Splatfest usually asked the players to choose between two competing preferences of a given theme, such as cats versus dogs, art versus science, love versus money, etc. During the course of a weekend or so, players would then compete in online turf wars to see which teams could win the most matches. The background of these events was given a humorous in-universe justification, as apparently Inkling society for many years has been somewhat beholden to the whims of an ancient fax machine, which often prints out random information which the Inklings are in the habit of interpreting as some kind of heavenly message, asking them to decide between each of the two Splatfest preferences. These online events were carried over into Splatoon 2 as well, albeit with a few changes to the overall scoring system over time. But when the Splatfest finally came to an official end for Splatoon 1, the first game's final Splatfest was one which forced the players to choose between the two idol hostesses of the game, Callie and Marie, and ended in a sweeping victory for the latter. It seems at this point that the developers decided, when developing Splatoon 2's Hero Mode, to have these results affect some elements of the story. Because Marie was the victorious party, when the player's Inkling arrives in the new setting of Octo Canyon, as opposed to Octo Valley, they are greeted by Marie herself, who has taken over for her grandfather while he is away. And so Marie initiates the new player character as Asian 4 to help fight against the Octarians, who have apparently stolen the Great Zapfish once again. Not exactly a very original plot at this point. Here is definitely the first negative, some would say, of Hero Mode 2, that it's kind of already repeating a lot from Hero Mode 1, and not necessarily in a way that feels like a continuation, so much as it can feel like a rehash. Not only is the initial premise pretty much the same, but the basic aim is also the same as well. The player must explore 5 hub sectors, uncover the warp kettles that lead to each stage, and then fight their way through hordes of Octarians in each stage to retrieve the mini Zapfish. And once 5 stages have been completed in any order, a boss kettle opens up, which, if completed itself, also opens the path to the next sector. It's all more or less the same, and as a result, at least from my personal experience, I have seen a more lukewarm reception to Hero Mode Part 2 over the years. Because outside of the more unique component of its story, which includes the subplot of Marie's cousin and counterpart Callie being squidnapped and brainwashed by the villainous Octavio, it doesn't seem to me like it ever made much of an impression with fans, and so it was just kind of dismissed, especially after the release of Octo Expansion. For a time as well, I also found myself kind of in a limbo as to how I felt about the hero mode in Splatoon 2. It was definitely below my original expectations just prior to release, but I couldn't say it was bad, no more than I could say the hero mode in Splatoon 1 was bad. But while there are valid criticisms of Hero Mode 2 as a retread, I've come to feel that many Splatoon fans greatly underappreciated the ways in which it significantly improved on the formula established in Hero Mode 1. And when certain higher expectations are set aside, and these improvements are looked at on their own merits, it's better to consider Hero Mode 2 not so much as a sequel or a rehash, as much as a soft reboot, if that isn't too much of a buzzword at this point. And that label probably applies to Splatoon 2 as a whole. When Splatoon 2 was first released, the launch version of the game was criticized significantly for being less of a Splatoon 2 and more of a Splatoon 1.5. And many returning players, including yours truly, did feel like maybe Nintendo had simply taken an overperforming game that was stuck on an underperforming console, that is the Wii U, and ported it to the Nintendo Switch with only the most minimal of changes to justify it as a sequel for marketing purposes.
Psycho Nara Production says, while I don't regret buying it at all, I was disappointed in the lack of content for Splatoon 2 on launch day, and how it didn't really up the ante from the first game very much. While I know that's changing now, I don't like paying $60 for what feels more like early access to a game in a beta state. Now, I know that Splatoon 2 didn't reinvent the wheel, but I feel like the updates are not meant to make you feel like you got a lackluster product, but more keep the game alive. And I know that they have made some sweeping changes in terms of how things function and even, the lobby systems and things like that.
Splatoon 2 is a fucking stupid game. It's a sequel in the way that Madden 2017 is a sequel. It's a shooting game with bad aiming. I don't know how much harder I can come down on a game than that. And yet I keep playing it. Why am I playing this?
There's a larger conversation here to be had, but this isn't the time for it. Unfortunately, a lot of these feelings that you might have, Psychonara, they're common. Especially now, like, people feel like we're getting games that are not complete, and then they're being completed post-launch with DLC and season passes, all of that. So that's just a big problem in the industry in general.
For this game, we're planning to add large-scale paid DLC.
Other than the addition of a multiplayer horde mode in the form of Salmon Run, the original release of Splatoon 2 was pretty much the same game, and early adopters were now awaiting future game modes and future playable maps to be patched in at a later date. The fact that Splatoon 2's hero mode was kind of retreading a lot of the same ground only seemed to add insult to injury, and solidified the theory that Splatoon 2 was just recycling assets and ideas in an effort for Nintendo to recoup their losses during the Wii U era. Because the majority of players expected to buy a Nintendo Switch likely did not own a Wii U, and thus never played Splatoon 1 at all, for those players, anything Splatoon 2 ever did would be new. So why try too hard to make Splatoon 2 stand apart from its predecessor, when you could literally just port the same game, slap a 2 on the box, and then take your time to work out all the finer details down the road? This initial displeasure with the recycled nature of Splatoon 2 at launch, and the drip-feed strategy of updates, I think soured a lot of players' launch experiences. And because Hero Mode 2 was part of that launch experience for many players who were jumping straight from Splatoon 1 to Splatoon 2, and finding that Nintendo was playing it safer than they expected, Hero Mode 2's generally superior level design, its superior difficulty curve, and its presentation and scale over Hero Mode 1 went largely overlooked. And the later release of the Octo expansion only overshadowed it further, just as that initial displeasure was likely wearing off. While the format of Hero Mode 2's levels follows more or less the same template as before, especially at the very beginning when the game is forced to assume the player is just a newbie, almost all the stages in Hero Mode 2 are longer and more challenging than the average stage in Hero Mode 1, and also tend to set themselves apart from each other a lot better with the introduction of a greater variety of environmental hazards and obstacles. In Splatoon 1, because Hero Mode only had the player using a basic splatter shot, the level design is only so dynamic, and as a tutorial for the new player, it only helps them so much to practice with only one weapon on a set of stages exclusively designed around that weapon, which is far from the case in the online multiplayer. Splatoon 2's Hero Mode stages, however, usually have the player cycling through a variety of weapons at the request of Marie's assistant, Sheldon the Hermit Crab. When playing each new stage for the first time, Sheldon will usually force the player to use whatever weapon he wants more combat data on, and this provides the in-game excuse for why levels are designed the way they are. An observant player can clearly see why a stage where Sheldon has the player use the Hero Brush or the Hero Charger is designed the way it is. The fact that the developers did not limit themselves in Hero Mode 2 to just forcing the player to use one weapon, and on top of that, did not limit themselves to designing stages around the Hero Splatter Shot as the default weapon, but instead chose to design each stage in turn according to a more specific weapon, allows Hero Mode stages a wider range of diversity than was ever seen in Hero Mode 1. Of course, upon completing a stage, the player may return to any given stage with the new weapons they've unlocked, and replay it with that weapon. In some cases, this might make a stage easier or more difficult than before, or may cause the stage to have slight variations. This is very reminiscent of the amiibo challenges in the first game, only now they're perfectly accessible, you don't have to buy a figurine. And there is incentive for the player to revisit old stages with new weapons, as by completing every Hero Mode stage from beginning to end with a particular weapon unlocks the Hero Mode variant of it for use in the multiplayer, showing off to the rest of the world the player's progress as a hero. The Sunken Scrolls also make a comeback in Hero Mode 2 as collectible items, and in my opinion Splatoon 2 does a better job of hiding these documents than the first game did. But on top of the Sunken Scrolls, there is also the addition of another collectible item called Sardinium, which, along with collected power eggs, can be used to purchase and upgrade your weapons. The addition of the Sardinium collectibles, alongside the Sunken Scrolls, can greatly increase the length and even the challenge of the Hero Mode stages, as players attempt to go out of their way to investigate each area or follow detours that may lead them to said items. On average, for a new player, or a player who has not played Splatoon 2 or its Hero Mode in some time, I'd say the average length of most stages in Hero Mode 2 is between 4 to 8 minutes, give or take. But the time or possibly lives taken to find all the hidden Power Egg packs, hidden food stand tickets, Sardinium, and sunken scrolls can greatly increase the length of a stage upon an initial run, especially if the weapon loadout is not something you're accustomed to. But exploration and collecting isn't entirely limited to the Hero Mode stages themselves, it also extends to the hub sectors too. As we already discussed in Splatoon 1, Hero Mode asks the player to use their inking and swimming skills to explore each sector in order to uncover the warp kettles leading to each stage, and the player is then permitted to enter the stages via these kettles in any order of their choosing. In this regard, again, Hero Modes 1 and 2 are virtually identical. But I would say that comparatively, Splatoon 2 does a better job turning the hub world into its own area, as each new sector incorporates in-stage obstacles in a much more comprehensive way than anything seen in Splatoon 1, making finding the hidden warp kettle a much trickier affair. And in addition, each hub sector has its own extra hidden Sardinium and sunken scroll stickers, making more thorough exploration more imperative for the would-be completionist. While finding the extra piece of Sardinium is simply a matter of finding a hidden crate to blast, to get the aforementioned stickers as well, one must track down a certain colored balloon floating somewhere in each sector, and play a shooting gallery minigame of sorts that requires them to travel all over the hub area, testing how well the player knows the environment to get a perfect score. Making each sector into a fully explorable, non-linear stage complete with side challenges of their own was something the first game desperately needed to incorporate more of. And so even though things like this are very, very minor of an addition, they help show that, theoretically, a more open-world Splatoon experience that doesn't detract from its more linear sense of progression, and which offers a wide range of collectibles and items that can be used even in other game modes, is fully possible, even if neither of the hero modes really reaches that threshold. Granted, there are aspects of Splatoon 2's hero mode where any positive or any negative criticism can also be thrown Splatoon 1's way. But I do feel like a lot of comments and criticisms that I see of Hero Mode 2 as being just a rehash are a bit overstated. Yes, it is true that Splatoon 2's Hero Mode is clearly using the skeleton of Hero Mode 1 as its framework, and even in some parts might be reusing assets or building on variants of older level layouts. And yes, the plot of the Octarians stealing the Great Zapfish and also taking one of the members of the Squidbeak Splatoon while they're at it is also not too new. But I think this could be chalked up more to standardization, coupled with the somewhat self-imposed need of the developers to redo a lot of their work, and to reintroduce a lot of ideas and concepts to the many players who may have never played Splatoon 1 at all. But a lot of the Hero Mode 2 stages feature more puzzle-solving elements that you almost never see in similar stages in Splatoon 1, and they also mix and match a lot more of the obstacles and enemies, where in Splatoon 1, a stage might have had a more singular focus or singular theme. Yes, all the obstacles and enemies you are familiar with from Splatoon 1 make their reappearance, but they are utilized much more frequently, and to a more precise degree on average, and are also accompanied by a range of new obstacles and enemy types that are not necessarily limited to one stage. In Splatoon 1, it can feel like even if you enjoy a particular stage theme or gimmick, like invisible bridges or moving platforms or sponges, their use is very reserved outside of the initial stages in which the concept is introduced. While in Splatoon 2, you'll have multiple levels featuring old obstacles like switches and sponges, and old familiar enemies like octolings or octostamps. But then in a lot of those same levels, you'll also have to tackle stuff like ink furlers, octozeppelins, giant squeegees, tentakooks, deluxe octocopters, grappling hooks, rotating platforms, octoballers, sometimes all in the same stage. There's a lot going on in some of these stages. Even the stages where you have to fight the octolings in one of the multiplayer maps have received a significant touch-up job, in that now they're more like scavenger hunts where you need to track down 8 mini zapfish, which requires more exploration and more familiarity with the map. And on top of that, the octolings have a more diverse and more dangerous weapon loadout than you might be used to, while sometimes also being backed up by other Octarian types to compensate for their own weaknesses. They're still pretty stupid at times, but at least now the octoling stages have a bit more going for them, and also accomplish their tutorialistic agenda in a much more all-encompassing fashion. I would almost compare the differences here to the differences you see between something like Donkey Kong Country 1 with Donkey Kong Countries 2 and 3, or Super Mario Bros. 1 with Super Mario World. It feels like a case where the sequel follows much of the same plot and format to to the point where they're almost identical in some parts, but the sequel or sequels clearly up the stakes and stack a lot of the new concepts and a lot of the old concepts you probably never saw mixed together to make stages feel longer, more intense, or more perplexing. Maybe in some areas this can feel cheap. Maybe you can say, you're still just searching for bonus rooms and fighting Kremlings again, or, oh, you're just running from left to right to save Peach from Bowser again. But the sequels are undeniably trying to push the boundaries of the format which was established by the original game. And to be perfectly honest, if we're talking about recycling and rehashing, it's very strange that Hero Mode 2 is singled out for this when the much beloved Octo expansion does it so flagrantly. It's very odd that Octo expansion can make someone play a game of Rainmaker on a repurposed Splatoon 1 map against recolored Octolings, then have them fight recolored variants of every Splatoon 2 Hero Mode boss, then have them play stages where all the enemy types are recolored Octarians and feature Hero Mode 2 obstacles like sponges, ink rollers, and ink furlers, and in between these have the player ride an ink rail and shoot balloons, just like they do in Hero Mode 2, before also having the player fight the same original boss twice. And none of this is considered recycling. Because, I don't know, they put floating GameCubes all over the place and have Pearl and Marina being cute? It does feel like there's always been a bit of a double standard when it comes to how people compare and contrast the Octo expansion with Hero Mode 2. I'm not saying Hero Mode 2 can't be faulted for some of the things it may be recycling, and even the story leaves a bit to be desired, as not only is it following a similar path, but it doesn't really offer much new information about the Octarians, nor does it give too much detail as to how or why Callie found herself suddenly in their grasp, as it leaves a lot of things kind of vague. Probably because it's trying to tell this particular story in between introducing its newer characters and its newer concepts, who actually don't figure too much into the story of Hero Mode at all, unfortunately. The point is, if we're trying to argue that Hero Mode 2 retreads too much familiar ground and takes an easy route of recycling ideas or assets, that criticism feels like it applies to a lot of Splatoon 2, and always has. All that said though, Splatoon 2's Hero Mode was overall a huge improvement over Splatoon 1, with a much more comprehensive sense of level design, a higher challenge ceiling, and greater replayability through the addition of more collectibles and in-game record keeping of things like completion times and which weapons you used. Character animations and cutscenes are also much more dramatic and expressive, and the additional music is top-notch as well, carrying on much of the tradition of delivering a strong sense of atmosphere to the setting of Octo Canyon. I mentioned in my Splatoon 1 retrospective that the music of the previous Octo Valley helped to add almost a bit of extra lore to the Octarians by way of juxtaposition. That makes something of a return in Splatoon 2's Hero Mode with a number of the new tracks, some of which feature vague and distant sounding vocals sung in the improvised Inkling and Octarian language that are obviously meant to sound like Callie being featured on otherwise Octarian produced songs, which of course reaches a more explicit climax during the end fight. The only criticism I would have here is that perhaps the overwhelming focus on the lost Squid Sister, as I've suggested, kind of distracts from developing the Octarians further as characters or antagonists. And it's on this point I want to focus for just a minute, because it ties into a broader problem with Splatoon 2's single player. I don't think the problem with Hero Mode 2 is that it's a rehash. As I've already argued, this criticism is very superficial, and I think mostly is the result of people not really knowing how to put the actual problem into words. Almost everything in Hero Mode 2 is either new or improved, so much so that even Octo expansion is forced to draw extensively from it. The real problem with Splatoon 2's main single player isn't that it's recycled, so much as that certain parts feel half completed. The fact that prior to the game's release, they were really hyping up the Callie is missing tale with promotional materials like the so-called Squid Sisters stories, which in my opinion should have been inserted in the game as added collectibles or something, and coupling this with the details given about the Squid Sisters characters' lives in between the two games, as well as the higher amount of detail and spectacle seen in the game's climax, there's definitely a sense that they wanted to tell a bigger and better story here, and that they wanted to complement this as well with the ways in which they're pushing the boundaries of Splatoon 1's single-player formula. While the formula, that is to say, the box in which everything is being put, is the same rough shape or size, there's a lot more being squeezed into that box than before. But something still ends up feeling like it's missing, like something is being deliberately withheld that would complete the whole package, and just make it all the more sweeter. Hero Mode 2 is not only far superior to Hero Mode 1, it is also a lot more ambitious in what it is trying to do. But I think as a result, the ways in which it follows some of the same pattern of Splatoon 1, in that it seems bogged down by many of the same external influences or considerations, can feel a bit more obvious, which is probably the source of much of the confused assessment of it. It still has to be the tutorial, so it can't be too hard for the new player. Splatoon is still a multiplayer-focused series, so it can't be too distracting by being too long. It still has to somehow tie into the multiplayer game, and consider the possibility that many players will never finish it, or will choose never to finish it, which means you need to make sure enough players can beat it in a short enough amount of time so almost nobody still has the Great Sapfish or Callie still missing, and thus doesn't know what everyone else in the community is talking about. And while Hero Mode 2 does offer more replayability, it can feel like the developers, who have to focus their attention on constantly updating and optimizing the multiplayer, just phone in some things to meet a quota. While it is interesting to replay Hero Mode stages with different weapons to unlock them in multiplayer without having to use Amiibo this time, it can also feel very tedious if you aren't just chipping away at it every once in a blue moon. Maybe adding more unique challenges, more new minigames, or more side missions might have been a better way to meet that content quota instead. But then that would also be a lot more time and a lot more work than the development team's bosses at Nintendo Corporate are probably willing to spare for a game that is marketed mostly as the big multiplayer Nintendo title, that has to be out by a certain date. And lastly, the biggest disappointment of Splatoon 2's Hero Mode is probably the final boss, which, while on much of the same level as the other bosses in Hero Mode 2, which are, to their credit, more difficult than the Octo bosses in the previous game, the new DJ Octavio fight is nonetheless a huge downgrade from the DJ Octavio fight of the first game, which had the player traversing an entire obstacle course just for a chance to even get close to the boss. But here, it seems to recycle a couple phases from that fight, and seems to think the spectacle of having to fight a hypnotized Callie compensates for a less complex boss fight overall. And I think this is why when we get to the Octo expansion, there's an opposite trend of the expansion almost feeling overproduced in comparison, and almost coming across like it's trying too hard to overcompensate for what the developers failed to pull off in time for the Hero Mode. Hero Mode 2 was supposed to be their big retry, and they just weren't able to do everything they wanted to do. So they dumped a lot of that responsibility on the Octo expansion, which in my opinion kind of hurt the Octo expansion itself. Replaying Splatoon 2's Hero Mode from scratch again made me feel a little guilty for not appreciating it more at the time of its launch. I was very surprised by how difficult some levels and bosses I hadn't replayed in so long actually were, and also by some of the depth and the intricacies of these stages, especially when I went back to try to break some of my old time records or to collect some of the weapons I never mastered. Seeing my completion times go down from as high as 14 minutes to as low as 2 or 3 minutes, it really made me feel like I was learning something. And playing levels I had come to know like the back of my hand gave me a satisfaction that I don't really get as much of from a lot of the more throwaway levels that you find in the Octo expansion. Again, I think Splatoon 2's Hero Mode didn't really get a lot of fair treatment. Part of it had to do with the developers not really meeting the expectations that they themselves had teased, and just kind of deliberately holding themselves back. And another part of it I think also had to do with a growing pettiness and superficiality among Splatoon fans themselves, ever since the cancellation of services like Miiverse and the dispersal of a lot of the more niche and otherwise self-contained online communities into the wastelands of Twitter and Discord. Where now the most serious crime of Hero Mode 2 wasn't its alleged retreading, but its alleged mistreatment of some insufferable nerd's waifu. Even though the plot of the Splatoon 2 Hero Mode should have been the most inoffensive Saturday morning cartoon-style plot imaginable. And even though most old Splatoon fans loved the idea of one of the Squid Sisters joining the Octo side, because as we talked about back in Part 1, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, the Octarians used to be cool. It made me happy to re-experience Hero Mode 2 with a more positive attitude though. But once again it made me feel sad too, because the formula or template of Splatoon 1 that it was so close to perfecting will probably never be revisited again in our post-Octo expansion world. But I suppose we'll have to save more of that discussion for Part 3 of this particular series.